Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. In today's episode, in our new series on the history of bad ideas, I'm talking to the writer and broadcaster Helen Lewis about the bad idea at the heart of her new book, which is published today. It's called The Genius Myth. We're going to be talking about all the many things that have gone wrong and can still go wrong with the idea of the genius, usually, but not always, the boy genius. What's wrong with genius? Helen, I want to start not by asking you why genius is such a terrible idea, but when are you happy to use it? Because I know you don't want to abolish it. This isn't like a fatwa against the idea of genius. So just to start with, so we can frame this before we really dig in, when are you comfortable calling a person or a thing, a work of art, an event, genius? When do you find yourself saying that was genius?
Oh, I find myself saying it all the time. It's such a casual word. Why is the Apple Store, does it have a genius bar, which is filled with, people who are quite good at tech support, but there's no need to over-egg it, really. But I think it's better to use it about ideas. And actually, I cribbed this from a way that somebody, I think it was Dan Trilling I used to work with at New States, once said it was much more effective to talk about racism in this way. That instead of branding people a racist, which was a label you put on them that they could never escape, a kind of stain they could never erase, it was much better to say, actually, this action is racist, this policy is racist, or this statement is racist, this word is racist, and then people can choose to do it or not. And it turns it from a kind of personal identity into something that's much more fluid. I think that's probably true of how you want to use genius. We don't want to deny that talent exists or that great works of art exist. It's been really lovely, as just we're recording this, people have been talking about Brian Wilson and his contributions to music. People genuinely celebrating somebody who was good at something and they exercised that talent to the full. I don't have a problem with that. But the problem comes with this putting a label on someone that's fixed and unchanging. And then really you have to keep calling them a genius, despite all the other things that they might do.
All the evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, exactly. And then a load of people turn up to dispute it, particularly if they want to have an argument about what that person represents. It's part of a kind of a bigger strand in my work about the difference between kind of beliefs and actions and identity, and the way that identity kind of can become a prison, I think.
And is it part of this thing, I think it's Brian Eno, isn't it, who has this word, which is never really going to catch on, let's be honest, genius, not genius. But obviously part of the theme of any attempt to understand a great work of art, I think that goes beyond, it was a sort of bolt from God, is that it happened in a context. There were things that went to make it. So when you call, say, a work of art or a book a work of genius, does it help to be able to think that that's not just about the person who produced it? Because it's a stretch of the word genius because we do so associate it with individuals. But there is a kind of feeling, I think, that there are some things that are created by human beings which are miraculous. But if you pin the miracle on one person and make it about who that person is and their identity, you actually miss what the act of creation is.
Yeah, there's been a spate of books that have been about people in creative pairs, for example, and how important that kind of is. And people have put very fancy words on it about, the kind of Bacchae and the Dionysian, and you need to have both of these in sort of balance. And that was a big strain in business studies for a while. And then talking about creative collaborations is also actually the most interesting work, and that is probably in business research, because there was an assumption that maybe, either you can spend, as I think Meta is currently trying to do, 9 figures per individual AI researcher, or you can try and recreate some kind of system in which you are helping every one of your, 8.5 out of 10 AI researchers all achieve their absolute maximum potential. And I also just think those are really interesting stories because we haven't told them, in the way that the feminists of the second waves in the 70s went through history and found all these really amazing biographies of women that we just hadn't told or explored or celebrated. There were a lot of kind of $1 trillion bills lying on the ground. I think there's a similar story about Senius, where it's often really interesting to talk about these particularly creative times and places. So, and one of the things that's lovely about the Tom Stoppard play Leopoldstadt is it gives you a really good idea about Vienna at the turn of the century and what a unique intellectual culture it was, and how what a loss to the world it was that was smashed up and destroyed by German and Austrian anti-Semitism. And I think those things that, Silicon Valley is clearly a place where where lots of people succeed who wouldn't have been able to do so without, say, venture capital investment, without the universities, without all of the things that make California a uniquely good place to be somebody working in tech. And as I say, I like the kind of underdog stories. And for me at the moment, I suppose Senius is the underdog story.
You write about the Bell Labs story, which is often held up as an example of this, where you have it's not a sexy name, Bell Labs. That's one of the reasons why people, Senius, Bell Labs, it doesn't quite sound right. It's not like art school, but clearly something about the way it was set up, the way it was structured, the way people were incentivized to work together. Bell Labs was kind of miraculous. Miraculous things came out of it. But in the telling of those stories, people just search for the individual. It's almost like, well, what they must have done really well at Bell Labs was find geniuses, find really smart people, rather than actually probably people who, had they not arrived there, we would know nothing about. Something happened to them there. And that's the thing that is, I think, often missing from these stories, isn't it? That even when we know the place is probably the story, retrospectively, we turn the story into how the individuals made the place.
That's one of the most interesting things I got from reading about Menlo Park, which has been appropriated by Silicon Valley as a name, but was originally in New Jersey. It was originally Thomas Edison's lab and workshop in New Jersey. And he was really lucky that he had both people who were coming up with brilliant ideas, but also brilliant technical people. So, when you look at the development of the phonograph, you have to have incredibly tight specifications for all the materials within it because you're measuring vibrations on a diaphragm. And they experimented with all the different materials that they needed to use. And that's the story of the light bulb too. Every man and his dog had an idea for the light bulb over the course of the kind of 1700s and 1800s. Just more and more people getting to the idea of like, what if I could burn something in a more controlled way? And it refines and it refines. And Humphrey Davy has an idea. And eventually people alight on this idea of, well, what I need is a filament and I need a vacuum in which to kind of create that incandescent light. But it's only really Thomas Edison who finally proves that it's a commercial viable invention by upgrading the specs of both the filament and also upgrading the machine that you use to produce the vacuum. And then he does the even more important thing, which I'd never thought about before. And this is your kind of classic point about it not being sexy, which is that he helps New York develop the power grid. And an idea of how you can pay for electricity and be metered on it, which I think was some complicated thing about deposits of zinc on a piece of metal to work out how much, electricity you'd burned. But the idea of making all of that work and making a whole city go electric is actually a kind of more amazing story than just going, I've had this one incredible idea. What if we burn something and then it produces light? But it's just not, as you say, it's not sexy.
So let's get on to the idea itself. It feels to me like there are two ways that people talk about genius, and you write about both. And there's a big problem with both, but it's a different kind of problem. And it is odd. One of the unusual things I think about the word genius is people just bandy it around, but they use it in these two very, very different ways. One of which is to describe a class of people. And sometimes the class is quite broad. I mean, it's surprisingly, the bar to entry is quite low. And we'll talk about some of those. Mensa, for example. I mean, I'm not saying I have no idea what my IQ is. I'm not saying it's not difficult to get into Mensa, but it feels unlikely that all of these people are geniuses. And then it's also used for that other very different thing, which is the very few people in human history who are just not like other human beings. They seem to have some divine spark, some sort of quality that almost makes them superhuman or non-human in some way. Shakespeare is an example of that, something mystical, mysterious about his gift. And Mensa and Shakespeare, these are two very, very different things, I think. And yet we use the word genius for both. And the problem with the word genius is not the same in the two cases. So let's start with Mensa and then let's do Shakespeare. So that desire to identify within a society a class of people who have this label attached to them. What is the impulse there? Is it always coming from the people inside the group?
I mean, I think, clearly people just love personality quizzes on the internet. BuzzFeed in the 2010s went through a phase of, like find out whether or not you're an ENTJ, the Myers-Briggs test and all that kind of stuff. Oh, horoscopes, I think, are a kind of version of that. And I think there is a sort of weird idea that IQ tests are a bit like that they can identify something within you that maybe you've always suspected, but the world hasn't seen. And suddenly it will kind of, you'll make sense of it. In the same way that people go, well, of course I found out I was an ENTJ. And you go, what does that mean? Did you not know you were an extrovert before as you were waltzing through your 15th party of the night? But people love this idea that you can kind of categorize themselves and they can understand themselves better through these labels. But you're right, the Mensa is the top 1% of the population in IQ terms. So depending on the test, roughly like 140 or so, where 100 is the average. And that changes over time, right? The average has got higher as people have got smarter over the 20th century, although that seemed to stop around the time that we invented the internet, which is probably a coincidence, but doesn't feel good. But the thing that's fascinating about that is that I hadn't realised quite the circumstances of the foundation of Mensa, which is 1945 in England. And it's an English guy and an Australian guy meet on a train. And one of them is obsessed with IQ tests and one of them's got quite a lot of money. And they put these two things together. And they are operating, clearly when you think of it, about 1945, in that moment of post-war egalitarianism. You know, this is the time when we are founding the NHS in Britain, when people are thinking about what will lead eventually to the comprehensive schooling revolution, when, you know, the aristocracy has crumbled because it's, you know, death duties mean it's impossible to keep those big houses anymore. There is a sense, you know, lots of countries after the Second World War in the Eastern Bloc go to communism, right? There is a sense that this is a kind of new mood, an end of kind of feudalism and aristocracy. And so what you get from the people who found Mensa is, in explicit or less explicit terms, they're talking about recreating an aristocracy. But this time, they're the aristocracy. It's an aristocracy of the intellect. And they will say things about, we have lost our praise for elitism. You know, we've lost the idea that some people have got great gifts to contribute and that they should be listened to. And so rather sweetly and naively, one of their first plans of what they want to do with Mensa is create opinion polls and sort out the big issues of the day by asking clever people. And now, David, you've spent a lot of time in a university, so I feel like you probably have a unique insight into sometimes you can ask a lot of very clever people very basic questions and you do not, in fact, get good answers back.
The old line, if you want to go to a university town and find the worst behaved people, go to the ethics department. And if you want to find the people who don't understand politics, go to the... I shouldn't say that, but it's kind of true.
Terry Pratchett mocks this very beautifully in his depiction of the unseen university in the Discworld books, that you just get a lot of smart people who are very smart on one topic, but they lack common sense, and maybe they lack people skills sometimes, but they also can't understand that other people value other things other than intellect, other than the things that they have. And I think Mensa was blighted by that from the start.
But it's also touching that they thought in an age where the old aristocracy were dying and this thing called socialism was coming along, they would create a new social elite to lead the way. And I think most people, when they picture Mensa, picture something that's a little bit sad and a gathering of people who I'm sure have many qualities, but social leadership is not one of them. For a start, the people who want to be in Mensa, I mean, it's a classic example of a club that selects for people who may not qualify for the role that they have designed the club for, which is social leadership, because you think social leaders probably don't want to spend their time in Mensa. It's an odd way of thinking about how to create an elite.
They did a research study not long ago about whether or not people with high IQs were happier or not, and they found out that they weren't, which went against previous research. And then people looked further into this research and discovered that they'd obtained their sample by surveying Mensa members. But this is exactly the problem. There's a line from Viktor Serebryakov, who was the secretary of Mensa, about the perception that people had of Mensa, and he said that people thought of them as brain-proud, quarrelsome underachievers. And that was the stereotype about them. And I have to say, I know lots of people who took Mensa tests who are perfectly well adjusted, but you find all the way through people talking about these clubs a persistent drumbeat of sort of upset that they're not better, and they get consumed by petty squabbles among people who thought that they were going to be having a lofty intellectual experience. Because now, particularly, I feel online, people are once again really obsessed with IQ. It is a good reminder that actually high IQ, good, brilliant, would always rather have it than not if, you know, it is correlated with lots of great stuff, but it is not a one-way ticket to success in life.
Petty squabbles among people who thought they were going to be on an intellectual adventure doesn't sound anything like the Oxford and Cambridge colleges that I know. The other problem with it is it's so arbitrary. I mean, so with the second category, the Shakespeares, the feeling is there's some big gulf that separates these people from the rest. If the entry requirement is 140 to be a genius and 139 isn't, that sounds like a very, very arbitrary definition of a genius. It's going to really make difficulty for the brand genius if the way you define it is with a line where the two sides of the line are almost identical.
Well, also just the fact that you get to the top 1% of the population in IQ terms, and that still isn't a particularly wildly exciting sample of people. I think one of the things you think when you reflect on that is the fact that great talent is incredibly rare. And it's just that we get to hear about a lot of them. I think that probably gives us an overestimation of how many of them there are. But yeah, I know I felt a real affection for the high IQ societies because they were full of people who were absolutely sure that this was going to be them discussing kind of, modulations in Bach and the work of an obscure 15th century poet. And what they ended up actually doing was arguing about who got to be, ninth official in the kind of ethics committee or whatever it might be, which was just very pleasing to me.
So then there are now the sort of pool shrinks through various categories. So we'll come on to Nobel Prizes. We've done a episode with Adam Rutherford about Nobel Prizes in this series, but I think we should talk about it some more. But there are other things like the MacArthur Genius Award. I was looking this up and it's quite funny. MacArthur spend all of their time issuing press releases saying, please don't call this a Genius Award. We didn't call it a Genius Award. We don't want the word genius associated with it. We asked newspapers when we announced the winners of our fellowship not to call them geniuses. And every year they say the winners of the Genius Award, because that's how people want to categorize this. I'm not sure what the numbers are. I think it's maybe 40 people. It's something in that. And it's been going for quite a while. So it's a much smaller group than the Mensa group. But it's still a lot of people to be geniuses, and it's a pretty random selection.
It's fine, and I like the criteria for it, which is basically like we're going to give you enough money that you don't have to worry about that, and you can do your best work. That I think that's a role that once a kind of king as a patron paid in an artist's life, or a university plays in the life of a research scientist. This idea of just we trust you. It's the same thing about 3M, who had the idea of 20% time. We'll give all our engineers 20% of their calendar back, and they can do whatever they want. And I think that's how the Post-it note was invented. It was someone sort of just going, what if paper but sticky? And then sure enough it made them millions upon millions of pounds. So it's always been quite mythologized on that basis. But there has been this sense that basically you have to have a level of trust in people. But then you have to pick the winners. And the criticism of the Genius Grants, in the same way of the Nobels, is that they are retrospective. How do you find someone before they do the really incredible research? What often ends up happening is that they reward somebody who's had one great work and then maybe they never have another one in them. So why are you giving this person now, it's essentially now an award for previous work rather than what it was supposed to be, which is a kind of guarantor of them being able to do more?
My favourite example of the MacArthur genius thing is in Little Miss Sunshine. I don't know if you remember. So Steve Carell, who plays the sad uncle, I think it is, and he's the second best Proust scholar in America. And his life is in ruins because the best Proust scholar in America stole his boyfriend, won all of the grants, and then got a MacArthur Genius Award. And that's the thing that destroyed him. The idea that it's the line between the best and the second best Proust scholar in this film is the difference between a happy life and ruin, but it is not the mark between genius and something else.
That is one of the things that you definitely see. And again, it's quite a heartening thing in sort of genius studies, is that people who are undoubtedly incredibly successful by any measure become obsessed with their one rival. Newton is a classic example of this, just absolutely obsessive hatred of Leibniz and a multi-year campaign to sort of destroy him and his reputation. And you think, wow, if Isaac Newton felt inadequate, in a way that really cheers me up.
One big difference between the MacArthur and the Nobel Prizes, the MacArthur people, I think the Guggenheim has a similar one that gets called a Genius Grant. They have gone out of their way to diversify the pool of people to whom this is awarded. So if you look at the people who've been getting it recently, it's a very diverse group, which is not true of the Nobel Prizes.
No, and I'm going to say something that is probably unpolitically correct, but I believe of long experience of losing awards believes me to true, which is that, and judging awards, people often deliver awards based on what they think makes them, the judges, look best. So the criteria for some of those awards, will have been about celebrating a particular type of science or scientist or a particular nationality. And now a lot of those awards will be very aware that if they name women, minorities, sexual or racial, that tells a good story about them, the judges, and their progressive values and the fact they're not wedded to this old white male idea of genius. So I'm afraid I sort of think, unfortunately, all awards are inherently corrupt, and you just have to make sure that they're corrupt in the way that you think is best for the world. And maybe that is about diversity. I think maybe that is about the fact that you want to try and celebrate people who aren't. Like when I judged awards, I always slightly think about, and maybe this is illegitimate, who would benefit from this award most, right? Who has already got a billion awards and this will just be one more thing, versus who for this, like journalism awards, who will this lead to them getting a staff job and then being able to excel? Who will lead to this being able to get that really big peace commission that they want, rather than just adding yet another gong to someone's, which feels kind of slightly lazy to me. Oh, that person's already been given the sign off of being excellent by everybody else and we can just add to it. all awards are inherently political. And that's what I mean about genius being inherently political.
So, at the risk of repeating the episode we did with Adam, but just briefly on the Nobel Prizes, because I think there's more to say about this, they feel like they are uniquely capturing all of the worst qualities of this kind of award in that they are retrospective, often for work done 20, 30, 40 years earlier. So they're going to old people, usually old men. And old men are not people you want to encourage to share their wit and wisdom with the world. So they're retrospective. They are, on the whole, not given because if you get the Nobel, it will open doors for you. All the doors have been opened. It's a comfortable retirement. The money's not going to go to any particular purpose. It comes with a label. Often the label is genius. I mean, or the word genius gets applied. And then what is the consequence? The consequence is just the people who win these awards are given a platform, or they are given a kind of status which allows them to roam more widely than their discovery. And a lot of them talk bollocks.
Yeah, because I think particularly if you have a lot of success in life and you get to a certain age, people do just stop contradicting you. It's not worth it. And you end up in a senior position in an institution. And again, lots of people, their lives are orientated around, making yours easier and certainly not in saying, that sounds like cobblers. So I think people just lose the feedback mechanism. There's that interesting research about whether or not CEOs are psychopaths more likely to become CEOs or do CEOs become psychopaths? Who knows what the answer to that is. But I do think if you become powerful, your inputs are really bad. I was talking to a comedian about becoming really successful, and the trouble with that being that your audience turns up already liking you and wanting you to succeed. And that is not the experience you had as a struggling stand-up when you actually had to be funny in order to get people laugh. Now, now you could get a certain number of people who will just be delighted to be there. And so you're deprived of that really useful feedback mechanism about what is actually good, what material actually works. And I think a similar thing happens to those grand men of science. They're just used to bloviating and people listening to them because their PhD students or whoever it is has to. Their poor wife has to. And then they come out and give an interview and they go, I've got a few thoughts about race. And then you just, no, stop. Don't do it. But, but that just has happened enough times that it doesn't feel like a coincidence now.
And you touch on this in your book, but it feels like there's a bit of a connection between the ways in which IQ and the idea of genius has been constructed through the 20th century to identify this class of people, and the fact that it is often race that these people end up talking about, or biology, or heritable traits, or whatever it is. It feels like it's more than just a coincidence that when you give them the Nobel Prize, these guys, when they put their foot in it, it's most often in that area. The thing that they want to establish and assert is that people are too nervous or politically correct to address the fact that there is this categorical distinction or there is this hierarchy in human beings. It does feel like those two things go together.
I think it's also just a kind of innate desire for attention. I write at the end of this book about how I've sworn never to write another book again, but I'm subject to a lobbying campaign by my friends who want me to write about this idea about the kind of midlife crisis, the intellectual midlife crisis, which I do think is fascinating and you do see all over the place. And I think William Shockley, who won the Nobel for his involvement in the invention of the transistor and then had a second career as an enthusiastic racist and eugenicist, he feels like so much a figure of the kind of Twitter era, and yet this was all happening in the 70s, in that he has this very successful career, but he gets to middle age, he gets weirdly obsessed with psychometric testing of his employees, intelligence more generally, in this very superior patrician reactionary way. And then he wins his Nobel and people start interviewing stuff. And for some reason, despite the fact that his background is in the hard sciences, decides to start thinking he's going to have some thoughts about biological determinism. And sure enough, what then happens is a cycle that, I'm sure you've seen many times on the internet. People push back and say, and often in very unfair and aggressive ways, and ways that actually overstate the science in the other direction. And then he just got it into his head that this was a bear that he could reliably poke, and he got some attention back out of it. And so for somebody who's maybe creatively peaked, they've actually run their race in terms of their first career and what they're really successful at, they can pivot then into a second career of saying mad shit and getting backlash to it, but also getting endless opportunities to say it because that benefits very well everybody around them and actually gets them some of the attention that they used to get from their creative projects.
So I want to talk about the second category of genius. And there is a link between what you were just saying. So the comedian who feels that their audience really wants to find them funny. the purest example of that is Shakespeare. I mean, I know lots and lots of people. I know lots of people who can't bear Shakespeare anyway, or a few, including the producer of this podcast. But even people who quite like Shakespeare can't bear to go to the comedies, the so-called comedies, because they're clearly not funny. And yet the audience is primed to laugh. Everyone knows, everyone recognizes what I would call the Shakespeare laugh, which is the laugh of an audience at a Shakespeare play when someone says, "Hey, nonny, no," and they chuckle because that's what's expected of them. Now, I want to come on to the question of whether Shakespeare actually was a pure bona fide genius. But clearly, even in the case of Shakespeare, he's not a stand-up, but even in the case of Shakespeare, there is a problem, which is once a label is attached, funny,
John Lloyd calls that the Radio 4 laugh.
oh, even worse.
He says it's the laugh not to show that you think it's funny, but to show that you understood the joke. And that is also the Shakespeare laugh. One of the worst things that I learned when doing Radio 4 comedy panel shows is you actually have to have the level of confidence to just stop an anecdote, and then people will assume, oh, that's the cue to laugh. And I couldn't do it initially. And then you realise that even when you're not funny, if you deliver something that sounds like it ought to be funny, people will simply laugh reflexively. And by then it's too late. They've laughed and it sounds like you said something funny.
So the Shakespeare laugh is a extension of the problem of this broad class of people that we call genius comedy. That was, you'll hear it about comedy a lot, right? That was absolute genius. We went to see this person, we were falling about his genius, everyone goes along and they think, well, we got to laugh, this is genius. But then Shakespeare is also Shakespeare. So having said it's not that funny, it does feel like there is a category of people, it might be very small, 10, 12 people in history, it might be broader than that, who just feel like they are categorically different from other human beings because something about their life, their work, the outcome of their thoughts or their artistic creativity is a miracle. Mensa no one's going to use the word miracle about Mensa. I think even with Nobel Prizes, I don't think on the whole people say, and then it was miraculous what happened. But I'm fine with people saying that Hamlet, or my favourite Coriolanus, is miraculous. It's like a gift from God. So you're going to have to push harder with me on this one. Why do we not want a category for those people? Or is it just that genius is the wrong word for it? Or do you just want to say that's another category mistake?
I think it's fine to have that category, but I think the thing that I hadn't really appreciated until I started reading some of the books about the period immediately after Shakespeare dies is that wasn't how people saw him in Shakespeare's day. You know, people went to see what they considered to be very good plays. They sold really well. He was a commercial success. But he wasn't treated with that level of reverence, which is the thing you find a real turn-off, which is the sort of kid glove sense of like now we're in the presence of majesty. People went along to something that was full of like bum jokes and maybe had a bit of a dog at the start. And so I think that's kind of fascinating to me that at the time when people were around Shakespeare, they thought he was good. Well, lots of people were quite jealous, right? Hence the upstart crow beautified with our feathers, which is a way of recognising that he was good, because you don't write that about your rival who's crap. But, you know, he wasn't received with this kind of level of reverence. So who had it in their mind to build the mythology of Shakespeare, and why were they so intent on it? And a lot of it turns out to be people later in the theatre who want to kind of claim they want to be the greatest Shakespearean actor of the age. You know, they want to be the great interpreter of Shakespeare, and they want a little bit of the reflected glory of Shakespeare to rub off on them. So polishing his mirror ever brighter is a really good career move for them. And so I don't think, you know, that if you want to call Shakespeare a genius, I think he definitely is, for me, as somebody who loves English literature, is up in that. You know, like I can recognise what's happening there and I like it. But I think you also have to recognise it didn't happen by accident. It was a process that turned him into the Bard of Avon, you know, the kind of greatest writer in the English language. And a lot of that was kind of marketing apart from anything else.
And how much of this in the history of the idea of genius, the way the word is used, is the other way around, in that it's not that people decided to call Shakespeare a genius, but the thing that they decided to turn Shakespeare into then fed into the idea of this word genius. And actually it was through the 18th and 19th century that this category of genius, the romantic genius, the poet as genius, the genius as the person who stands apart, that builds on what people had done to figures like Shakespeare. Because the word genius, it didn't always mean what we think it means.
No, and by the time you get to Samuel Johnson, it has started to mean a superior person. But, you know, you had a genius until that point.
It was your alter ego, right, in a way.
I also, until I started researching this book, hadn't quite clocked the romantics and the tortured genius. There are definitely the way that Michelangelo is depicted struggling painting the Sistine Chapel, but the idea of being very close to mental illness or unnecessarily being super unhappy with these great gifts is really something that the Romantics praise, and I think that comes about it being part of you. If you're looking at an earlier conception of genius, which is I've designed this brilliant cathedral because I was inspired by God, why would you be unhappy about that? But if it's that you've been given this great talent that marks you out from humanity, then you can immediately see that that is something you're more likely to see, well, it's a gift, but also a burden. So, somebody like Shakespeare, actually, he's not a tortured genius. And it's really interesting. You see these attempts to now in popular culture go back and think it's kind of quite cute to depict Shakespeare, with writer's block. But actually, that's not how he's depicted by his contemporaries. He's depicted by his contemporaries as a kind of working hack. It just happens to be that his level of hackery was a lot higher than the rest of us can manage. I thought that was one of the things that I really most enjoyed doing this research was finding all sorts of things that I just were natural and unquestioned. You could almost spot the moment where they'd been born as ideas, which is always a really fascinating process to trace.
The Shakespeare in Love version of Shakespeare, it's interesting because it's sort of half and half the two things you're describing. I think it's a great film. And it works quite hard to portray Shakespeare as the man who brought the crowds in because dogs did funny things on stage and they were laughing. But it can't resist three things actually. First of all, he has to be a bit tortured. And then the inspiration for Romeo and Juliet has to come to him in a flash, which it does. There's that bit where it just pours out of him. And then, I think it's very moving in the film, but the performance, it's the opening performance, but it's the end of the film, where the audience are watching. And to start with, they're amused. It's Shakespeare. We're looking forward to this. We're going to get drama, excitement, romance, whatever. And then it suddenly starts to take a hold of them. And by the end, they're having a religious experience. The camera cuts to their faces and they are in rapture. They are literally enraptured by this thing. And they have been transcended to a higher plane. And it can't resist that, even though it starts with them all just looking forward to a bawdy evening at the theatre. By the end, they're in church. So even Shakespeare in Love, which I think is a good portrayal of the complicated way in which Shakespeare has been mythologized, can't resist it.
Yeah, when you're talking like that, it made me think about the fact that I'm always someone who's felt like Shakespeare is a slightly more dutiful thing because there's a lot of bad Shakespeare. It definitely is not easy to make good. And I thought, well, maybe maybe we've just lost it. Maybe we just do not have the kind of psychological mindset that his audience initially had that allowed them to understand and see these plays. And then my friend Robert Icke, did that production of Hamlet at the Almeida with Andrew Scott. And the scene at the end of that is there's Hamlet on stage and everybody's behind glass and they're dancing and it's a party and it feels like heaven, and he goes to join them and they hand their watches in. I was on the verge of tears and I was like, oh, Shakespeare is good. Like, it's not just one of those things that you kind of intellectually appreciate. Like, it can be a genuinely straightforwardly human emotional experience. But Rob's whole thing is about stripping away all the kind of performance tradition and trying to get back to the text. And the thing that he would always say about Hamlet is that is a play that is about Protestantism and Catholicism, right? Is the ghost real? Is for an audience, the first audience watching that, essentially a religious question. And that we just cannot access that now. And Hilary Mantel did a wonderful series of Wreath lectures in which she talked about the role of religion in the Tudor mindset and the fact that, we just can't think ourselves back into a way that those people thought. And so that's the wonderful thing about Shakespeare, that he has survived all this time despite our interaction with him changing so much. But there is also a kind of, he has to be remade every time because we're not watching Shakespeare in the mindset of his original audience. We can't ever access that again.
So instead of understanding what Shakespeare might have understood by religion, we've turned him into a kind of secular religion. In our age in which actually we don't have a lot of people a religious impulse, sometimes the closest thing we get to it, like in Shakespeare in Love, is through high art. High art is presented to us as something where we can't get it in church, but we might get it, we might get it in the cinema, we might get it in a concert hall, we might get it at a comedy gig. There's almost like a thought that something transcendent can happen in these things. And that is part of the genius myth, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's why in some ways it's more suited to artists because it's about a kind of unique subjective experience that you have, and actually often a collective one. Someone like a musician being called a genius, it often is about someone's own what those songs meant to them in their time in their life. It's the song that you listened to that summer you were 17 and you just, or whatever it was. It's the song you had your first dance at your wedding. Like all of those things that they're kind of embroidered into your life. You create a lot of the meaning. You meet the artist halfway, which you kind of can't necessarily do when you read about the discovery of penicillin. Like it can be objectively impressive, but what? Or maybe scientists go into raptures about it the way that I do about going to a Taylor Swift gig.
So the torture genius that you mentioned there are lots of examples of it. There's one kind of subgenre of the torture genius, which is the genius who wasn't recognized. It's almost always him, so I'm going to say he here, wasn't recognized in his own lifetime. So Van Gogh is probably the template for that, but Kafka is another, actually Nietzsche is another. Three people who, well, in Nietzsche's case, he went mad, so he didn't know what was going on. So he actually became famous when he was mad, so he didn't realize he was famous. But basically, three people who, when they died, didn't know what they were going to become. And I think there is something genuinely quite distressing about looking back and thinking, wanting to say to Van Gogh, it's such a shame that you didn't know that you were Van Gogh, to Kafka, even to Nietzsche, actually, that you were going to become world historical figures. But then that does feed into a kind of myth, which is you might be one of these people, even though nothing in the world is signaling to you that you are Van Gogh, because it didn't signal to Van Gogh that he was Van Gogh. I mean, that feels like one of the more pernicious versions of the way that genius sends people a bit mad, the idea of aspiring to genius, which is you could be one of these people without, in your own lifetime, there being any mark of it.
Yeah, there's an episode of Doctor Who, actually, with Van Gogh as a character, in which the payoff is that Van Gogh is bloody miserable, and the Doctor, by travelling through time, takes him to like the Musée d'Orsay or somewhere, and he takes him to a Van Gogh exhibition and goes, "Look, people, they love you. They really love you."
Does it cheer him up?
Well, clearly not, because he's still in this timeline kills himself a couple of years later. Okay, let's not go into the semantics of that. But I think it's such a powerful idea for two reasons. One is that we love the kind of sense of bittersweetness in a genius story. Like any story needs a kind of sense of sweet and sour. It's like the salted caramel thing, right? And then the idea that you were so great but you never knew it is just very poignant and I think really appealing to people. And there's a sense of what Robert Merton, the sociologist, called like of history as the ultimate appeals court. And I think there is something that appeals to us about taking on that role. We're making it right. We're restoring justice to the world, and particularly when it's people who are overlooked for like political reasons, for example, because they were Jewish or because they had mental illness or something like that. We feel that we've done right and we've restored something that they should have had. And that reflects, again, it comes back to this idea that it reflects very well on us, I think. But when I think about all those stories, I also think they speak to us about something about if you've ever lost somebody, one of the worst things is that first feeling when you want to just argue with it. You want it not to be true. You want to bring in the ref and like VAR on them having died. And you sort of have to deal with the fact that you can't. And I think that's often a note that comes out in all of those stories, right? You want to call a kind of historical VAR on Kafka so that he knew. And it chimes very deeply with that kind of experience within us.
And in that category of people, if we're not going to call them genius, because it does deflate the story a bit too much to focus on the ways in which Van Gogh, after his death, it's very interesting to see the ways in which a person who in their own lifetime was nothing is slowly burnished and celebrated and then marketed, because it does become a marketing story. I mean, Van Gogh is now a brand. But to focus on that too much, it doesn't just make it a less moving story. It feels like it does lose something of what I want to call the genius. I can't think of another word. The absolute spark aspect, the kind of setting apart aspect of the original life. Not least the doggedness, the willingness of the person with this gift to keep going in Van Gogh's case.
Do you know, that's the thing I think is really interesting, and I hadn't quite... There's a piece by Robert Hughes about this, which is very brutal, and it says the thing about Van Gogh is that he was crap for a long time. And I just thought, wow, okay, this is like you're being rude about Shakespeare. Bit harsh, but when you look at the Potato Eaters and that early phase of his career where he was mostly painting in brown, if he'd stayed in his brown era, he would not be the Van Gogh that we know and love today. And it's when he sees the Japanese woodblock prints and he starts getting interested in colour theory, and he starts seeing about, if I put red and green opposite each other, if I put blue and yellow, all of that kind of stuff, that he blossoms and develops as an artist. So you could equally tell the story of Van Gogh as the story of the kind of grinder who just kept going and, nursed what talent he had and made something of it. But we don't like that. And this is what I mean about the fact that who we call a genius says something about what stories we find most appealing. We definitely find the idea of poor, mentally troubled Van Gogh, nonetheless producing these beautiful canvases, the most appealing version of the Van Gogh myth that we could currently have. And that, in 200 years' time, that might be completely different. He might be celebrated in a completely different way. But I know what you mean. There is a winnowing about which version of the life you want to have. And, that happens. Jackson Pollock is a really good example. You can have the people who want to say, oh, it's all just scribbles, isn't it? My 5-year-old could have done this, versus the people who think it's a very good sign of their rarefied taste in nature to be able to understand the dribbly paintings. Again, it just, like, what you like says something about you. Who you call a genius says something about you.
There's another category. Again, I think an artist's probably the best illustration of it, which is the Picasso version. So the Picasso version is not unrecognised in his own lifetime, super recognised, to the point that when he was an old man, he was allowed to get away with all sorts. But he's the version of the life where the reinvention is remarkable. And it's not just that he did something amazing at a particular point in time. Even after the world had decided that he was a genius, he carried on doing things that were startling in many ways, reinventing himself, rethinking what it was that he was doing in ways that maybe because he was Picasso, people gave him more of a free pass. But still, there are those rare people who take the label of genius and kind of run with it across most of a life. And that also feels very, very rare.
I think Picasso is a really interesting person to study at, because you're right. I personally prefer the early work, not his super early work, not when he was like sort of 16 and he was doing slightly dreary family scenes, but the rose period and the blue period. I think he, just as a draftsman, he's just absolutely stunningly. And I have to say, I don't massively love the Cubist stuff. I can understand like what an incredible revolution was, and what it felt like to see Demoiselle d'Avignon for the first time was just genuinely. The kind of interesting thing is there's a book by Arthur I. Miller, not the famous Arthur Miller, about Einstein and Picasso, and it points out that he never went into pure abstraction. He'd lived long enough to see Mondrian and or Yves Klein just experimenting with blue, but that he never went all the way into that. And that's quite interesting to me too, that at what point does it kind of run out? And there are, to be fair, I also think he is very lucky not to have drastically cheapened his legacy. I went to the Picasso Museum in Barcelona, and they've got, for some reason, 8 versions of a window with some doves in front of it, increasingly slapdash looking. It was clear that he was sort of knocking one out a day. And so I think he was very lucky not to have cheapened himself in that sense by being over commercial. There's always this trade-off for all kinds of artists, singers, writers, whoever it is, about as soon as you become super popular, the elite then start to like slightly look down their noses at you, that you've become a commercial artist. And I think his mythology of the kind of Breton shirts and the bullfighting and the women and, the whatever it was, helped him to still seem kind of edgy, even though he was making an absolute mint.
The person who's sort of half Picasso and then not in this version of genius, I kind of think is David Bowie. I mean, I know a lot of men probably of my generation who think he is the genius. And part of that is because he did reinvent himself. He was the chameleon. So there are these phases through from the early 70s to the mid 80s where he's doing lots of different things. I don't think he's a genius, but really well, very, very well. But then it stopped. He kind of lost it. So the music then he was making in the 90s is not, I think, something that anyone would listen to out of choice.
And Craig Brown and I talked about this in relation to the Beatles, that the Beatles stopped, for very good reasons, whereas the Rolling Stones just carried on, and no one wants to hear the new material, but they're still gigging and touring. And that's, again, people find that slightly unsatisfying.
I think with David Bowie, it actually burnishes his genius, the fact that the gift seems to just leave him. So he makes the Tin Machine albums, and you kind of go, this is so bad that the person who made the other stuff clearly is not totally in control of what he's doing. And it's not just the drugs, it's divine inspiration, if you really want to sort of elevate it. And so there is almost something that burnishes the genius myth, which is if the person who makes this art goes on to make stuff that's sufficiently bad, it feels like something is happening. It goes back to the origin of the term, outside of themselves. And they are just the vehicle for this thing. And I think there are probably people who think that about David Bowie. I know there are people who think that about great writers, about Shakespeare and others, T.S. Eliot, where when they had the gift, it was properly moving through them. And then when it goes, it's not by choice, but it's also not something that they can do anything about.
I think it must be one of the worst things that could happen to a person. There's a line from, what is it, F. Scott Fitzgerald? And there's something about, and I am just like you now, which is a kind of an incredibly superior thing to write about your gift going. But I can imagine it must be so, Like, imagine just like sitting down to the piano and you've completely forgotten how to play the piano. It must feel like that to those people. And this is what I mean, why I think probably those very successful people, maybe sometimes often in middle age, do have a really rough patch. There's a line in the Hans Eysenck book about genius about if you want to be called a genius, either die before 30 or keep marching on till 80. And I think that part of that is a reflection of the fact that, yeah, if you rode the wave of some zeitgeist when you were in your 20s and 30s, fashions inevitably change. And maybe, I don't know, in Bowie's case, it was that musical tastes changed, or that, something else. Maybe, people were more interested in, oh, now we do rap music. And you could go, well, I'm a white artist. Do I try and have a go at that? And it might be embarrassing. Or do I just keep doing what I'm doing and then I feel like I'm one step behind? And those are the questions in a creative career that are quite tough. It doesn't apply to all of them. I think it's easier for novelists. Novelists seem to be able to just march on through time. But I think for pop stars, it's tricky. For mathematicians, it's incredibly tricky. They do seem to peak quite soon.
So I want to finish with offering you someone, and I want you to tell me if this person is a genius, what is he? It's a novelist, it's Dickens. And I think Dickens is interesting partly because it's a version of the Shakespeare story. So some people sometimes write, if we had as little information about Dickens's early life as we do about Shakespeare's early life, there would be a whole industry of people saying he didn't write the books, because it can't be true that this kid who was sent to a boot blacking factory and whose education was interrupted to the point of non-existence and more or less had to just fend for himself. His father was in debtor's prison, just emerges in London as a young man in his early 20s. And is Charles Dickens. I mean, is fully formed as Charles Dickens, and the writing from the beginning, from the Pickwick Papers onwards, it lives in a way that nothing else at that time did. It's got a kind of human quality to it that seems to transcend everything else that's going on around it. But we know in his case it is true. So no one says Dickens didn't write the books. There's enough evidence. And it's sometimes people say this is the best argument for Shakespeare writing Shakespeare's plays, which is Dickens wrote Dickens's books. So why would you think Shakespeare couldn't write Shakespeare's plays? And then Dickens, people differ about whether there are better phases and worse phases, and some of the novels aren't as good as others. And he was not a nice man, and he treated his wife abominably, and he was a drunk by the end. And by the end, it's quite squalid, I think. But my God, he sustained it. And it's all got, not all, but almost all of it has got the spark. Almost all of it has got a thing where Dickensian means something which no one else really can do. And it's to do with capturing human beings and giving them an identity on the page in a few brushstrokes. This thing of just repeating phrases that get associated with these characters. And in the way that it's astonishing how many of Shakespeare's phrases live on, how many of Dickens's characters live on. These characters, some of whom are quite minor characters, David Copperfield, which is my favourite one, the number of characters in that book who are just alive in a way it's almost impossible to compare to any other book. I want to say that man was a genius, so tell me I'm wrong.
I'm not going to tell you you're wrong and I'm going to disappoint you before I do, which is to say I'm not sure I've ever read a Dickens book all the way to the end. I've loved The Muppet Christmas Carol.
Which some people think, including the producer of this podcast, is a work of genius.
It is a work of genius. Honestly, when Tiny Tim dies in that and he's that little tiny frog, that's it, I'm gone. But this is what I mean. I think that is an argument actually for Dickens's character genius, in that he manages to create emotionally manipulative scenes that, even if refracted through the prism of the Muppets, still have the power to move you to tears. But I'm not going to argue against that, because I think what you're saying is that Dickens means something to you, and Dickens's specialness, there's a kind of something that you just think, how the hell did this happen? That you find personally an encounter with the transcendental, whatever you want to call it, encounter with something that is something like feels kind of slightly otherworldly. And I think that's something that we all crave in our lives. So I don't think you want to kind of grubby that up. And I think that's one of the things that people, when we talk about the kind of roads must fall and then the movement of decolonize the curriculum and all that kind of stuff that happened afterwards, one of the reasons I think people reacted really strongly against that wasn't just purely kind of reactionary racist defense, but it was a sense that they were going to have things that they like taken away from them by the morality police. And I don't think you do have to sign off on Dickens's treatment of Mrs. Dickens in order to think that Uriah Heep is a great character and a great comic creation. The final chapter is called An Idea That Won't Stay Dead, because essentially we want it, we crave it, we haven't got time to go into this now, but about the discussion in AI. My editor said to me, can you say something about AI?
Editors always say that.
Yeah, I know, right? It's peak 2025 conversation. But if you found out that Dickens had all been written by an LLM, it would cheapen it to you, I think. Right? You would just feel cheated at that point.
Yeah, I haven't actually tried to see how good they are at Dickens impersonation. I imagine they're quite scarily good now, but there would still definitely be something missing.
Yeah, but that would horrify me. I would feel that was unheimlich. I would just feel that was wrong, because actually then it's something that is an encounter with another mind. There's a line about James Baldwin that I love about art being a kind of confession. And he said, you're reading something. It's a great comfort to the struggling soul that you're reading something and you're finding out that an emotion you had, Dostoevsky was having 150 years ago. And I just think that's sort of what maybe the bit with Dickens is, if you go, oh my God, that type of person that I've met in my real life, I've met somebody who's like Uriah Heep, existed in Dickens' day, right? It says something really profound about human nature, that certain kind of things just persist across time. And I think that's maybe what you're kind of seeing as genius, that he had some gift of perception into humanity that you find just exceptionally insightful.
And it is one of those rare examples. The problem with the LLM version is I'm sure they can do a brilliant 600-word pastiche. They probably now, because they're getting better all the time, probably could do a chapter. I'm pretty certain they can't do a Dickens novel impersonation. But the thing that they definitely can't do is the life. They can't do the Dickens life, keep producing these things, the way in which they change, the way in which there's continuity through them. They can't impersonate a human life. And I know that part of the problem with the idea of genius is it gets attached to a life. And that doesn't really make sense, because it ends up meaning that we call things genius, which are actually the opposite. They're kind of awful, including in Dickens's case, awful. In Zadie Smith's book, The Fraud, where Dickens features there. And that Dickens is also completely recognisable and I'm sure true to the life. And you wouldn't want to attach too many elevated labels to that guy. But there is something about the life, the way in which the whole life has something running through it, which makes it, so maybe this is all I'm saying, makes it uniquely human. Even if it seems otherworldly and divinely given, it's so human. That's what the LLMs can't do. They can't do the life.
But he wanted it, right? I mean, you'll know far more about this than me, but he used to give public readings and people were weeping and wailing and like Little Nell and Tiny Tim. It became about an audience, like the audience created a lot of that meaning, right? Because you went somewhere to listen to Dickens reading. And yeah, you were in the presence of Dickens, which automatically put you in this heightened emotional state. I bet they, like, to go back to what you were saying earlier, I bet that was a bit like going to church. I bet that was collective effervescence for a lot of people. And you only get that by hearing it directly from Dickens. And so I think he really helped his genius myth by being somebody who was willing to do the public side of being an author rather than just writing the books.
Would you be happy that he could both be a genius and also a beneficiary of the genius myth?
I think that's completely fine. And I think, I'm not the genius police. That's a doomed thing to say. But I think what's really interesting is to ask what you're saying by saying that someone is a genius. And actually, it's my favourite kind of argument because it's an interesting, it's not about who's right or who's wrong. Like, it's ultimately, you could argue that forever, but it does make you think really profoundly about what is it you value about Dickens and what is it you're prepared to kind of brush to the side. And there'll be other writers, we don't look very favourably on Ezra Pound's fascism these days. We certainly don't look very favourably on his middling poetry. But you know what I mean? Like, there is a kind of, we all weigh all these things in the scale. And it's so interesting to see how that changes over time and how that changes from person to person. It is quite revealing about you to think about what you think of as genius. So that's my mission anyway.
We should do a screening of The Muppet Christmas Carol and see if we can turn it into a religious event. You can get Helen Lewis's The Genius Myth wherever you get your books, ideally in real bookstores. Next time on The History of Bad Ideas, something a bit different. I'm going to be talking to the historian and podcaster, the host of History Hit, Dan Snow, about the idea of the decisive battle, the view that wars are settled on the battlefield and that there are great battles that have changed the course of human history. Dan Snow is going to explain why that's not just a bad idea, it is a terrible idea. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.